Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 11th and final MLA Sheep Productivity and Profitability webinar of 2017. Tonight's topic is chemical manipulation to increase lambing rates in prime lamb ewe flocks. What pays and what doesn't? And this is going to be presented by Dr. John Webb-Ware of the McKinnon Project. So this is our last webinar for 2017. I'm glad that you're able to make this webinar. Now, we'll be recommencing the webinars, I suspect, in late January. We haven't bedded down the plan as yet, but we'll be recommencing the webinars in late January, and they'll be running through to the end of this financial year. So we'll be looking forward to getting some new topics and presenters to you in the new year. So keep an eye on your emails and on your text messages so that you're able to attend them when the time comes around. This control panel is going to be on the right-hand side of your screen. Use the red arrow to collapse and reinstate the control panel. You can hear us, but we can't hear you. And please use that questions box at the bottom of the control panel to enter questions throughout the webinar, and they'll be addressed by John at the end. So to introduce our presenter this evening, some of you may be well aware of John's role in the industry, but he's a senior consultant with the McKinnon Project at the University of Melbourne. John advises predominantly to sheep and beef producers throughout southeastern Australia. He principally in farm management and production, wherever the objective is to maximise profitability. John also is a member of various farm management agriculture related committees. It undertakes teaching of undergraduate and postgraduate ag students at the University of Melbourne. John Webb-Ware also runs a sheep and beef property with his partner on the outskirts of Melbourne, which no doubt will take up a fair bit of his spare time. Now, with that, I'd like to introduce John. Can you just let me know if you want me to go forward a slide?
Okay, rightio. We're on management systems is the first priority. And look, I think realistically, it's very important to get at the time of lambing, stocking rate, ewe nutrition, ram management, the whole calendar of events on your farm right first before you start manipulating any alternative chemical means of your reproductive performance, because there's huge gains to be made in all those areas. And it's really important to get them right first, because if you try and complicate things with chemical means before you've got your system right, then you're asking yourself to fail in some respects. So if we move on to the next slide. So we go to specifically talking about Regulin. So I think if we start talking about Regulin first, it's quite a novel chemical in terms it's using a hormone which tricks the brain into inducing cycling activity out of season to specifically increase the ovulation rate. So if you just flick forward to the next point, David. So it's how you actually use it is you implant a small implant at the base of the ear, which you can see in the picture, roughly about 40 days pre-joining. Now, this product is only beneficial if you're using it out of the main breeding season. In other words, once day length is reducing after Christmas, and particularly from February onwards, the benefit of melatonin is not going to, there's going to be no benefit because you're already in the breeding season. So effectively what this product does is tricks you're into cycling and increasing the actual ovulation rate out of the breeding season. Okay, so so it's particularly beneficial over that for most breeds of sheep before Christmas in particular, so the late spring and summer. Okay, but with this product, like all products, it's really important to use it in ewes which are in a decent condition score to start with. It's no substitute for poor nutrition. And also in immature ewes, they've got to be mature enough, sexually mature enough to be cycling in the first place. Otherwise, this product won't be suitable in that situation. It is also, by the way, it can be used in rams out of season to improve their sperm semen quality. So, and sexual activity. But again, what are the potential benefits of regulins? And this slide shows you a summary of trials which were done over the in the spring, mid-spring to early summer, and it was a summary of quite a few trials across Australia showing the benefits, both in first cross ewes and merino ewes here. It does a couple of things. Number one, it actually reduces the number of dry ewes. And so there's some ewes which will be an anestrus, which are basically not cycling. And this product enables, reduces the numbers of ewes, both in first cross ewes, it was roughly 3% less dry ewes. And also, because you're increasing the number of ewes with twins, you're reducing the number of ewes with single lambs. And so more twins, less singles, less dry ewes, and the outcome of this of all the trials in the average for first cross ewes was about 16% extra lambs born to for ewes joined. And also the other thing, there was a slightly tighter joining period as well. Okay. Now the same sort of very similar results with merino ewes in that spring to early summer period. So less dry ewes and less singles but more twins, resulting in a higher number of lambs born to ewes joined, and again a tighter joining. Interestingly, is the product isn't recommended for British breed, pure British breed type sheep, such as Romneys or Cooperworths early on. So you can't trick them into early cycling activity because they're deeply anestrus or earlier in the breeding season. So it's really not suitable for those types of breeds after mid-January. But they recommend before mid-January. So if we just flick through to the next slide. So, I mean, I guess with all this, I mean, that's pretty impressive sort of results. But, I mean, at the end of the day, and we've made a caveat that we've got decent nutrition and decent management system in the first place. So, does the product pay? And so what we've looked at is systems where we're lambing at what would regard as a more optimal time versus early lambing. And some people are hell-bent on early lambing, and that's fine. And so I think you need to recognise that this is a product which is not going to be suitable for later lambing flocks, where we generally recommend that be the case anyway, or at least not too early. So I've looked at it on a gross margin per hectare and a gross margin per DSE basis for a few different scenarios. We used a bioeconomic model, grass grow, because it's a complicated system, to model with the higher number of lambs born to ewes joined with early lambing system compared to a slightly later joining time. And we used it in 4 different locations where we had data for, and to see if there was any difference between locations. And we actually used actual trial data in populating the spreadsheet. So the assumptions were we used first cross ewes, and they're reasonably fine first cross ewes, and we where they were shorn just a typical first class ewe fleece, 4.6 kilos. I was shorn mid December when lambing at the optimum time, and if they were early lambing, they were shorn in September. The cast for age ewes were sold at 7 years old in January, or with optimum lambing or early lambing in October. Now, Regulin was assumed was costing about $6.25 for the implant per ewe, and that was added to our animal health costs, about $3 a head. Supplementary feeding, if it was used, if ewe body condition fell below 2.5, or ideally we're keeping them in about condition score 3 particularly over that joining period. And we used a long-term barley price of around $240 a tonne. Now, lambs were sold in November, and with the optimal lambing systems, and we tried a couple of different scenarios with either with early lambing, with carried through to November a heavier weight, or in the earlier lambing systems, they were either sold in November or sold in earlier in spring to try and catch higher prices. Now, we used just an average lamb price when I did this modelling earlier on in the year, and with higher lamb prices, I think the average lamb price for the last 3 years to be a bit above $5 per kilogram, or $5.20 for over 18 kilograms, and the skin price of $8 was used. Now, the effect on conception rate and ovulation rate of the Regular depended on which season was used, but we used actual trial data, but the response ranged from 7% to 27%. So we move to the next slide. So now this just shows some of the assumptions. We used the optimum lambing time of either June or July with a sale time in November. Now, it hasn't got it in this slide, but the earlier lambing times for Cow and Aracourt and Rutherglen were, we used an April lambing, and for Wagga we tried, because it was the data we had, we actually had a really early lambing in March. So that was the basis of our assumptions. Now, look, the stocking rates with the optimal lambing time were around 6 ewes per hectare, and a little bit for 5 to 6 ewes per hectare, or equivalent for with a first cross ewe. That's the stocking rate of roughly 12 to 14 BSEs per hectare, depending on reproductive performance. And during the stocking rate was a little bit lower. Oh, sorry, for Wagga the stocking rate was a little bit lower. So we just move on to the next slide. And this is just to give a perspective of the conception rates with and without Regulin and with Regulin for the optimum lambing time, and early lambing time without Regulin and with Regulin. So for Cow, where joining was in January, and the conception rates without Regulin were 135, or the ovulation rate, sorry, were 135 and went up to 155%. So that's conception rates. And for early lambing, so joined in November, without Regulin 111% and 132% with Regulin. So even with the January joining, we got a response, which was actually a little bit of, there's very little data for the January joinings, but based on the product development, which wasn't published, they were getting they were assuming a 20% response still in January, but the response after then rapidly diminishes, so it's a lot less. But at Naracoorte, there was only a 7% response. You can see with, and so it went from 148% to 155% with Regulin, and it went from for the early lambing, it went from 96 to 112%. And in Rutherglen, there was a 20% response with a January joining, and it was a slightly higher response, so 106 to 133%, so 27% response with with the November joining, and Wagga was about a 20% response with a January joining and a 22% response with an October joining. So they're the sort of responses we were getting in terms of conception rates based on real data. So then we with using, and this was a rehash of work we did some years ago with lower lamb prices. So I thought, well, look, it'd be really interesting to see with current lamb prices or thereabouts. And these prices we modelled are actually a little bit below where the current spot prices are, but they're the average for the last 3 years. Now you can see there I've got for the 4 different regions, you've got the first 2 bars for each region. So the blue and the red, are the optimum lambing time. The first one is with Regulin, and the second time is without Regulin. And for and the same, so the blue and the red are right the way through, or with and without Regulin. So you can see there that in terms of a gross margin per hectare at lambing at the optimal time, there was a small increase in the gross margin per hectare. Narracourt, actually, where there was a smaller response achieved, there was a negative benefit of using Regulin, and even so, the responses are reasonably small in matter in tens of a couple of percent increase. So it's not a large increase right across the flock, right across the spectrum. You can see for the green and purple bars, though, that there is a bigger response, which is to be expected when we consider there is a bigger response in terms of conception rates with using Regulin, which those extra lambs generated actually it achieves a bigger financial benefit. But one thing that's important to look at there is that with chasing earlier lambings and potentially chasing higher prices where there's premiums for earlier sold lambs, because they're slightly lighter, the lambs, and because there's also substantial extra costs in feeding, the earlier lambing was not as profitable as the later lambing in most systems. Now, this is where lambs were sold to chase early season prices, okay? But it didn't achieve that ends, and lambing a little bit later, the lambing in June, July, which is would generally regard as a slightly better time, depending on the region, generated higher profits with. There was look, and like I said, it wasn't a substantive increase in profits. Now, with lower lamb prices, the cost of the Regulin certainly outweighs any benefits under all circumstances. But and certainly using it later and we used a fairly optimistic response for January joining with a 20% response, where there's actually not a lot of published data to that we're using basically. When they originally developed the products, the claims of the company which had the product at the time. So, but certainly after a January joining, you're unlikely to get anywhere near the responses we're talking about here. And with the cost of the product at $6.25, or you're talking $600 per 100 ewes, $625 per 100 ewes, it's unlikely to have any benefit at all. Okay, so we move to the next slide. Okay. Now, this slide shows at a gross margin per DSE level, which is telling a similar story with where we didn't change stocking rates. Now, the one thing we didn't with this Regulin model, with the higher reproductive performance, there is a real and intangible increase in stocking rate. Now, we didn't adjust these figures for the higher stocking rate. So if you were up at the higher, already up pushing the limit stocking rate wise, you're not, the extra cost is not going to yield the benefit which we're achieving here, which I must say are pretty small under any circumstance. Now, this is a situation where we carried lambs through till November rather than selling them earlier to chase early premiums. But because they're older lambs, they were a bit heavier. the early and late system. So the first two, the two green columns are the with Regulin, and the black and white column are the earlier lambing with out Regulin and with Regulin. See, you can see there's a bigger response with the earlier lambing again, is because there's a bigger response with reproductive performance. But even in that situation where we're carrying much heavier lambs right through, and without adjusting for that high stocking rate, using the Regulin didn't and chasing the more lambs earlier didn't achieve a more profitable outcome. So unless you're stuck with early lambing and not prepared to change, there's an opportunity to manipulate your profit with the earlier lambing systems. But the other way of looking at it is to actually lamb at not a late time, but a slightly lower risk time, and achieve higher profits anyway, and get the benefits out of the natural cycling of the ewes. And in 3 of these trials, we've got a small benefit, but it's really only a very small benefit. And in one trial, there's a negative benefit because the response wasn't big enough to cover the cost of the Regulin. So if we move on to the next slide, David. Oh, sorry, we've just got a couple of little things here. Sorry, back to that last one, if we could. Sorry, it's small writing down the corner there, but we just looked at the simple return on investment, and so when we were lambing at the optimum time, we never got I always like to see with a marginal investment we get a 30% marginal return on investment, and at Narracord it was a -58% return, which is just a dead dark. But at the other, we got a reasonable return, 20% increase at Cowra, Wagga and Rutherglen. But with the early lambing, it was a very healthy return on investment because we were where there was a bigger response. But the issue is chasing that earlier lambing. Sure, you improve the profit, but it's not as profitable as lambing at perhaps a less risky time anyway. So going with the early lambing is a much higher risk with excess supplementary feeding, and it's always a more challenging environment to go too early. We did model different fodder cropping systems in this, so not making any comments, so they're pasture-based systems. But really, the gross margin of the later lambing system really exceeded with lambing at a slightly later time. So the early lambing systems weren't as profitable. Okay, so we just move on to the next slide. So in summary, look, Regulin generally gives a positive response with early lambing, and that's fine. But there is higher risk associated with that, and it's generally not as profitable as the later lambing systems. And if we adjust the stocking rate truly to take into account that extra reproductive performance, then the profits wouldn't be consistently high. So that's a really important point to understand. The second issue to consider there is with this is obviously with all this, the early lambing, cost of feed, time of sale. We've got a better response where we carried those early lambs through spring and to heavier weights rather than getting lighter weight lambs at high prices in early spring. So, but I mean, look, when we did this a few years ago with lower lamb prices, it just couldn't work. But it's much closer to working now. And if you could rub your crystal ball and say you were going to get $7 a kilogram with earlier lambing, so on, well, look, there might be a higher value proposition. But I think to me, it's complicating the system. It's not necessarily the most profitable long-term way to go. So it's really important to understand that in the overall equation. So that's if we just move on to the next slide now, and I just want to go through the next product, Ovastim, which is a product sold by Furvac. It's actually quite a neat product as well. It works on a totally different mechanism in terms of the melatonin is based on day length in the ewes, and this is quite a different product in that it's effectively a vaccine which blocks a particular steroid, which goes in the feedback of the ovulation cycle, the feedback loop with ovulation, there's a particular steroid which depresses the ovulation rate. Now, this particular vaccine actually blocks that steroid from decreasing the ovulation rate. So it specifically works to increase flock fecundity. So effectively what I'm talking about there is more twins. And so that's an important point to understand, in that it's working with more to increase the ovulation rate with more multiples, rather than what the Regulin is working with increasing twinning rate, sure, but it's also reducing the number of dry ewes. So it's a 2 ml subcutaneous injection. It costs about $1.25 a dose, and in the first year, like a lot of vaccines, you need 2 doses initially, and then you can just give an annual booster. So in the first year, it's $2.50 or thereabouts, and in subsequent years, it'll be $1.25 per dose plus your labour to do it. But you would time those 2 doses to do the booster dose in the first year, the second dose 4 weeks before joining, so 8 weeks before, minimum of 8 weeks before, then 4 weeks before, and then subsequent years a booster 4 weeks before joining. So if we just move on, and like I said, $2.50 in the first year, and that's just the price that I checked recently. So what's the effect? The average response is an increase in about 17% lambs marked. And look, when I first, this has been out, this product, for a long time, and like all these products, I'm always keen to have a look at them. So there's always producers I deal with always keen to do to see whether they do work. So sure, we went out and used the product, and we got responses which were very much in the order of that 14, 15, 16, 17, 18% increases in lambs marked through additional twinning and multiple ovulation rate. So it certainly didn't increase or reduce the number of dry ewes, and in a couple of cases we had a few more dry ewes, which was a bit of a worry. We weren't quite sure what was going on there, but certainly on average we're getting more lambs marked. But it's look, you've got to pick your flocks to use this product. There's no doubt about that, and I don't recommend it, and it should it for use in merinos. I've had clients use this product in merinos over the years, and they've sometimes they've got away with it quite successfully. But it's actually, a lot of merinos have enough troubles rearing twins anyway without complicating the thing with lots of twins. And it's not an option where you're really pushing the system and nutrition is not right. It's really important to get nutrition right first. And so ewes in poor condition score, and particularly with high stocking rate type environments, I don't think it's a good choice. Get the nutrition right first. And obviously where insufficient feed with multiple ovulation, it's just not right. But I mean, look, the rules with lifetime ewe management certainly play here in terms of managing nutrition of multiples to keep more alive. But with all these products, it's all very well getting extra twins born, but there's a real challenge in keeping those twins alive to get the value out of the product. And so it's really important. Nutrition is really important. And certainly, as a general guide, we wouldn't recommend it in enterprises marking less than 70% lambs, or even 80% lambs, really, or 90% lambs to get that right. But certainly not in, we wouldn't use it in flocks which are high fertility prime lamb flocks where they're already marking 140%, because really, realistically, in that situation, the vast majority of ewes have got multiple ovulations anyway. So it's in that window there, particularly where you've got decent nutrition, you've got, and I think where I've got my most reliable responses, where you've got lamb marking percentages in prime lamb flocks of about 110, 115% in good nutrition, and then this might be a real option. Okay, so move on. If we just move to the next slide. So we've just got a couple of points there. Is that you must be able to meet, well, we'll talk about twin bearing requirements in the last point there, is that you must give in the first year 2 doses, and then an annual booster in subsequent years. So it doesn't carry over. It's an annual booster required for ewes which have been previously vaccinated. Okay, moving on to the next slide. So we modelled this. We used the farm in southwest Victoria to model this, and this is actually this is based on some real trial data here, where they were getting their 120% lambs marked in the base flock, and this we took into account every bit of they're already pretty heavily stocked at 8.5 ewes per hectare, so roughly about 22 DSEs per hectare with first cross ewes. They were producing about 470 kilograms of lamb per hectare, and average lamb weight was 45 kilograms, and the gross margin at current commodity prices with the base system is about $747. So, adding our Ovastim to the flock, we had a gross margin per hectare of we increased it. If we totally disregarded the extra reproductive performance, we went up to 136% lambs marked, produced more lambs. They were slightly lighter weight, obviously, because there was more of them, and the pasture utilisation went from 43 to 46%. So that's all good, but part of that increase is from an increased stocking rate of about roughly a 15% increase. Sorry, a 7% increase in stocking rate from 20.4 up to 21.7 DSE per hectare. If we're in a situation where the stocking rate was right at the upper limit, then realistically, I mean, the extra benefit is not only coming from extra lambs marked, but it's actually also a higher stocking rate component. Now that might be fine in some situations, but if we backed off that stocking rate to enable the same pasture utilisation and roughly 20.4 DSE per hectare, so we dropped from 8.5 back to 8 ewes per hectare, we still generated a much higher gross margin, but it wasn't as much as if we took the full benefit of that with totally disregarding stocking rate. Okay, so there's real value in this product. And again, this is a flock which was right in the middle of that window where their reproductive performance was not great, and Ovastim had a real benefit of, and it may well have been the genetic merit of the flock. It was not good enough to have enough multiple ovulations or so on, but here's one way of manipulating reproductive performance to generate higher profits. And I've no doubt in this sort of flock, it can work quite well. I'm really wary of it in merinos because I think there's real challenges with keeping those extra lambs marked. So it needs to be a really favourable environment. I wouldn't be doing it in southern western Victoria, but certainly in inland areas where the wind chill is and it's great, there might be merit in it, but particularly if there's really good nutrition. So these are sort of effectively tactics to increase the stocking rate on the farm and generate higher profits. And the reason why the benefit is quite substantial at the moment is because, as you well know, the land prices are so good at the moment. So if we move to the next slide. Okay, so just a summary with Ovastim. Look, I mean, if you're in that window where you've got moderate reproductive performance, it can give you a favourable return on investment as long as you can keep those extra lambs alive, and if you can do that with any moderate cost, then there might be real benefits of using this product in those flocks. But don't go there if you've already got really high reproductive performance. You may well get too many triplet type situations in that sort of situation. That isn't an issue with Regulin, but I just don't think you need to go there if you've already got lots of multiple ovulations. So it's really in that window in between. If you've got really poor reproductive performance, I'd be strongly counselling to look at nutritional management as the first step of getting things right. So, I mean, look, and I think you can't ignore that part of that reproductive performance is stocking rate, and for some people that might be a real benefit because you're increasing your stocking rate, but if you're right up there at the limit, that will come at either extra cost or real penalties in decreasing productivity if you tip over the edge stocking rate wise. So it's really important that you have the system right to start with before you embark on it. Okay, so thanks very much for that, and I think we've covered everything. But look, if there's questions regarding, more than happy to discuss that or any other things related to the products.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, John, for a great presentation there. Thank you for sticking with us through our technical woes there. John did a very good job of adapting to the situation, as I always suspected he would. But so we got through that, and yeah, it was a very succinct and a webinar with a lot of real outcomes there with the gross margins per hectare and per DSC, so we can get a real feel for what the benefits of these products may be. Now, just while John's having a break there, don't forget the post-webinar survey. You're welcome to leave any comments, feedback, critical or positive, and that will assist us help build the webinar program into the 2018 year. Don't forget that we will be recommencing the webinars in late January. We will be in touch with you via email and then by text when we have our next webinar and presenter organised, so keep an eye out for that. And yeah, you're welcome to head off for your evening now. We went a little bit over time because of our technical woes, but if you want to take the opportunity to ask John some questions, then it's not often you get a man of such expertise in the room, and he's offered to stick around for as long as you want to answer those questions. So thank you, John. And we've got a few coming in here. I might kick off. Are you ready for a few questions, John?
Yeah, go for it. Yep.
John, there's a question here from Neil. Neil asks, could you use, and Neil would have been referring to Regulin, can you use this on merino ewes that failed to get in lamb the previous year?
Look, I think yes, you can. There's a couple of issues. Again, if it's going to be, the response is going to be more consistent for if you're using the product before January joining. So you implant 40 days prior to the planned mating date. So it's going to have no value for later joined flocks because they're already ovulating anyway. And so it's really and look, just remember some of those, a considerable number of those dry ewes which don't get pregnant in the first year. There's a chance thing, and if you're specifically looking at maiden ewes, there is certainly with some of the merinos, I find the body weights of the merinos are just not high enough for their level of maturity to cycle, and a big part of the low cycling activity of maidens in merinos in particular is an immaturity associated with light body weight, and it's amazing the number of times where we've said, oh yeah, but they're good body condition, but I mean, but actually when we've actually looked at it, I mean, there's one of my colleagues did some great investigations of flocks with poor fertility, and there was a consistent message there that while the ewes were in condition score, what they said were condition score 3, no problems, but actually when we weighed them at the start of joining, ewes were actually only in 32, 33 kilograms, and we all thought, oh yeah, there's something odd going on here, but when we weighed them, it was a direct body weight response, and when we looked at the pregnancy rate in relation to the body weight, it was a very much a close correlation. Heavier ewes got pregnant. So just back to the question though, in terms of a substantial number of those ones which don't get pregnant, they've had an early embryonic calamity and misalliance because the embryo isn't consistent with life, and so that always happens. It happens with all mammals, and so I mean, look, there's some of those which did get pregnant. They couldn't maintain the pregnancy, so dropped out. So I mean, not I mean, a lot of I wouldn't necessarily target those ones which were dry previously. There were some of them would be just genuinely barren ewes for some reason. There's always a low percentage of that. But a lot of those ewes which don't get pregnant, when we've followed them through subsequently, we've found that there's really an equal chance of them getting pregnant the following year. I've got no problems with what I do generally if people want to get rid of dry ewes is 2 strikes and out. So, but I think 1 strike, it's a bit of luck involved, and so if they just don't if they're dry 1 year, a lot of them will get pregnant the following year, particularly because they've had a pretty easy run a lot of the time, and they're in good condition the following joining. But 2 strikes and out, absolutely, it's quite a reasonable strategy. But 1 strike, and I don't know whether I'd go and chase give them Regulin those dry ones, but if you're an early lammer, joining before Christmas, there might be an argument, but with the high commodity prices at the moment, if you're an early lammer and understocked, well, I mean, this is a way of increasing your production. It's not necessarily my preferred way of doing it because there's more risk involved with the high nutritional requirements with higher fertility with early lambing. But I mean, if you can manage that, there might be benefits with Regulin, as we saw from the responses which we got with the high lamb prices which are at the moment. Okay.
Perfect. Thanks, John. John, a really good question here from Rob, and Rob asks, John, has any work or modelling been done to compare spending the $6.25 on Regulin compared to spending the same amount on supplementary feed to increase lamb turn-off weights, or maybe on the ewe prior to lambing for lamb survival? From Rob.
Now, look, yes. I mean, look, so with the $6.25, there is a fantastic return on investment from ensuring ewes don't lose weight before joining. Okay, it is very cost effective to do that. The return on investment from there's a much smaller return on investment from increasing the body weight of ewes with supplementary feeding. Now, generally speaking, to maintain weight, it costs. It takes about roughly 28 megajoules of energy to stop a kilogram of weight loss, whereas to increase, which is effectively 3 kilograms of grain. So it's a really good return on investment, but where it only really costs about $20 a lamb. So it's a good return, extra lamb produced. But if you are lambing in trying to increase the body weight of ewes to get higher ovulation rate there, then it doesn't give you a nearly as good return on investment, because there's effectively 2 to 3 times the amount of grain required. It might cost you $70 or $80 per extra lamb produced. So you'll get a return on there at the moment, but it's not very exciting. I mean, look, things like other ways of manipulating fertility, such as people talk about flushing, and I think you've talked about that in previous webinars. I mean, my experience, it's not always consistent and not reliable. So I mean, my attitude is if you've got green feed and they're on dry feed, yeah, it might be an opportunity, but it's sort of more an opportunistic type thing, the flushing. But certainly there's a good return on investment from stopping weight loss before joining, but not as good a return on investment from increasing weight. There's a moderate return on investment where maiden ewes are still below target mating weight, so at least 75% of mature weight. There's a better return on investment from them, because some of those ewes, it's not only extra ovulation, but some of them aren't cycling if they're a bit too light. But if they're way too light, I mean, if they're 30 kilograms and they need to be 45, that's a hell of a lot of grain you're talking about there. But if they're 42 kilograms and need to be 45, there's not a bad return on investment with that one too. So that's one where there is a potential opportunity at the moment. And look, there's a whole plethora of different strategies where you can get terrific returns on investment. And look, I think in this situation, what we're talking about, a 20% return with using Regulin where we're joining in January, and with reasonably optimistic responses, it was a much better return on investment from the earlier lambing systems, but there's a whole plethora of things which are going to give you a great return on investment on farm fertiliser, pastures or whatever. It's not my highest priority. I'd tend to do get the management system right, which is all about management rather than cost to start with, and then you obviously look at different strategies and what's going to give you your best return. So we could talk all night on that one, but I'll cut it out there.
No, thanks. Thanks, John. A good question here from another David. Is there more benefit of applying Ovastim to ewes identified maybe through EID that have consistently only had singles, or would it be better to cull them and replace them with more young ewes?
Look, it's a good question, and if you've got ones which are consistently single ovulations, then it's a good point. And I haven't actually, it'd be a tricky one to model because I'm not quite sure whether I could have an answer of whether there's a consistent response. But I mean, in essence, what you're trying to target those ones with singles to get multiple ovulations, aren't you? So intuitively, I mean, if you could target those ones which had singles with EID, then yeah, it's certainly probably something which is worth having a serious consider about, because the marginal return on investment in that situation you would think is going to be higher if they were truly going to be singles for the rest of their life. But you've got to understand that not all of those ones, if you've got 2 years of being a single lamb, I mean, it's not a straight line correlation that they'll be singles for the rest of their life. So that's one thing which, I mean, they need to think about, getting the right data there to do the calculations there. But if we made an assumption that there's a high probability of them having single ovulations for the rest of their life, then the answer is sure, targeting those ones would intuitively give you a better response, would they? Okay. So it's a good thought, but I'm not exactly sure of the right answer to give you without all the information. But I like the idea.
Thanks, John. Thank you. Just take just so you can have a break there, John. Ladies and gentlemen, you're welcome to send in any questions or comments that you think are relevant to tonight's subject matter, and John will be more than happy to address them as they come in. There's a quick question here from Russ in relation specifically to Ovastim, John. Russ asked, can Ovastim be used for early joining?
Yep. It's not limited by the time of joining, but just be mindful of the management required with the extra nutritional management if you've got really early lambing in terms of multiple ovulations. So it certainly, I've only used the product with later lambing, but it's not sort of tricking the early lambers. So you're not going to get a response with ones which aren't cycling. You're effectively just getting more twins. So I suspect your response is probably a bit better with later lambing, but I haven't seen the data with the earlier lambing to say that. But it's not sort of limited by season per se in the first instance. Okay.
Right. Thanks, John.
So it's really important to go back to that nutritional management and keeping those extra lambs alive. Okay.
Okay, John. Well, that wraps up the questions for tonight. If anyone else has got a last-minute question, please drop it in there, and John will see to that. But I might take this opportunity to thank you, John, for contributing to the MLA webinar series.
Okay, thanks very much, and it's a pleasure. Okay,
well, thank you to everyone out there for supporting the webinars through 2017. Now, don't forget to have to leave some feedback in the survey after you quit out tonight. And we're going to be back in late January to recommence the webinar series. So if you keep an eye on your emails and on your text messages, we'll let you know what the subjects are and when they're going to be run. So please keep an eye out for that. on behalf of MLA and the MLA webinar team, thanks for being part of tonight's webinar, and we'll see you early in 2018. Have a good evening.